slightly less well known is this: never go in against a Sicilian when death is on the line.
Wow, it happens so fast. We're talking today about cardiovascular disease. And one of the things that I like to point out is what our good friend Michael Phelps said about cardiovascular disease, where he said the problem with heart disease is that the first symptom is often fatal. I really enjoy presenting to my first year physical therapist assistant class on the topic of cardiovascular disease, and I give them a whole chapter in a pathology class that I teach where we talk specifically about cardiac events and cardiac disease. And I always open that by stating a question to them about what they believe the most common symptom presenting in the emergency department of hospitals from a person experiencing cardiovascular disease or cardiac event. And I get a very big array of answers. And these are really intelligent students. And it always starts out with chest pain or shortness of breath. Sometimes they even get really, intricate and say, well, they have a Kerr sign where the pain's going down their left arm or up into their neck. Jaw pain, stomach pain. Sometimes it's even, that they passed out. All these answers, and they always get frustrated with me because I keep telling them, no, incorrect, you don't have it. And so finally, when I can see that they're really stressed, I announce to them somewhat facetiously that the first and most common presentation at an emergency department is death. Yeah, they show up dead, clinically anyways, but that's called sudden cardiac arrest. Now, the good news is we have come a long way in the treatment of cardiac arrest, and our healthcare system does a phenomenal job. We have cath labs and we have different diagnostics that help us to identify a person's current status, and we have life-saving techniques that are just second to none. So that's really good news. But Michael Phelps is true. The problem with heart disease is that the first symptom is often fatal. So we want to tell you that this module specifically is going to address identifying what cardiovascular disease is. We're also going to try to categorize for you the top 5 cardiovascular diseases in America. We're going to discuss major risk factors. That's right, a new category. We're also going to talk about the relationship of cardiovascular disease and a little something called diabetes. And then we're going to round out with discussing the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Well, we're also going to kind of start there. In fact, we want to remind you of what we all deal with. And this is kind of unique because cardiovascular disease is the one disease that will probably be present in you and me and every American as we are lowered into our grave. Most of us, if we're lucky, we only get out of life with maybe a small amount of morbidity. In fact, it's probably true to say that, some of us will never experience cancer or diabetes or Alzheimer's, but almost all of us will experience to some level that disease known as cardiovascular disease. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to kill us, although it takes out a lot of us, but all of us will exhibit some form of cardiovascular disease when we're dead. So we want to prevent, we want to push back against that morbidity. We want to push back against the diagnosis of cardiovascular disease. And that is obviously the goal of this module. So what is a cardiovascular disease anyways? Well, it's any disease or injury. And I don't mean like you get punched in the heart. I mean like you've developed some injury and some scarring on the heart from maybe ischemia or just atherosclerosis, and we'll get into those later. But you've got something going on at the heart or possibly even in the blood vessels. Now, you look at this picture and immediately you think, well, there's not that much going on there. I mean, look at those blood vessels. There's not that many of them. And then I would have to tell you, this picture is a vile injustice of what the circulatory system really is. In fact, you could look this up on the internet, because that must be true, but you can look it up and find resources that suggest that there is up to 60,000 miles of circulatory system in the human adult. Now, that's astronomical, but it also helps us to understand that there's a lot of real estate, right, that could be involved in this disease. So no wonder it's a big deal. And it's also a big deal because it's kind of that iceberg. Remember the iceberg we talked about in the first video that every one of us is going to hit? Well, this iceberg has a very big submerged surface, and so we want to keep that in mind. Now, it is America's biggest killer. We addressed that in video 3, and we identified for you that most Americans die as a result of cardiovascular disease. And so we have to kind of keep that in mind, but also we need to understand that it's a silent killer. It is an iceberg, and only a very small tip of it is seen. And we're going to identify for you the reasons why that is, but most of us don't even know it's occurring. So that helps us to understand kind of a piggy bank analogy of why it's important to understand this early in life. You see, things that you're doing today, decisions you're making today and tomorrow and the next day and the next, everyday decisions are a deposit into your savings or piggy bank. And for some of us, we kind of max out that piggy bank a little sooner than others. In fact, what we know is that the primary risk and the largest risk factor is age. And so at a certain age, we become very vulnerable because we've deposited that money into that piggy bank very rapidly. And what we know is that for men, that age is around 45 to 54 years old. For women, you don't start until much later in your 50s and sometimes into your 60s, but it is delayed a little bit. But what we know is that that's pretty young for all of us. And if you don't think that's young yet, wait 20 years and report back to me about how you feel. But what we know is that prevention strategies, they're cheaper, they're easier, and they're a heck of a lot more durable than any treatment strategy. So you have a choice, right? You take the ostrich approach, you put your head in the sand, you do nothing. You depend on medicine. And while that has proven to do a lot for the acute treatment, it's not doing much for the prevention. And I'll kind of make that make more sense here in just a minute. But what we know is that it's a very durable thing. And so we're going to ask that you consider, what can I do to prevent cardiovascular disease? Well, let's just talk about what the top 5 are. Number 1, you have hypertension. That's high blood pressure. And why that's a big deal is because more Americans will have high blood pressure than any other cardiovascular disease. And that's anything over 120/80. And a lot of you are like, wait a second, mine's 124. Do I have high blood pressure? Well, you kind of have pre-hypertension, so you probably need to be paying attention. And the big problem here is most of us, and about 40% actually of Americans, have no idea what's going on with their blood pressure because they don't go to annual checkups or even remotely come close to doing this twice a year. So you might want to be paying attention to what your blood pressure is, especially if you're not going to those checkups with your doctor. Another thing is atherosclerosis. Now, unfortunately, this is not identified until you are on the morgue table and they're kind of looking into your body to see what killed you, and then they find out that you had atherosclerosis. And that is a narrowing, but it's also a hardening of our arteries, and it's kind of like a dried up water hose. It just doesn't pump that water very good, and so that's a bad deal. Another thing is coronary artery disease, which is broken up into 2 categories. Number 1, it's ischemia. And ischemia is where really we lose, and I said that wrong, but there are 2 categories, but the primary reason behind those 2 categories is ischemia. Ischemia is where we have a blockage or something that is causing less blood flow into an area. And that's very specific at the coronary level, or the arteries that serve the heart. So This is really going to result in two things. One is angina, which is chest pain, and it comes because there's a lack of blood going through an area, and that can be broken down into two subcategories. Number one, it can be stable, where you look at a flight of stairs and you say, if I walk up that, I'm going to get chest pain. The other one is unstable, where you don't know what's going to happen, but an exertion is going to occur on your behalf, and it's going to cause chest pain. And that's a very scary thing, because it could be angina, or it could be the next thing, which is a myocardial infarction, also known as a heart attack. And that is a very, very scary thing. Now, we also have these things called arrhythmias, and that is basically looking at the electrical side of your heart and saying, you know what, there's a little problem with the way your heart beats, and that can come up too. And if it does, there are some medical procedures, but also some very unique medications out there that help with that. But it's something that you would have to have diagnosed. And a lot of times it's just because you feel really bad, a lot of times after exercise, where that arrhythmia occurs. Another one is congestive heart failure. And this happens to people in their 40s, 50s, or 60s, where they just really are fatigued all the time, and they can't quite meet the needs of their daily life, and they really feel run down. And you're like, well, isn't that what you're supposed to feel like in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, especially if you're working 40 hours plus a week? Well, this is a little different because it's not something that you get over. And so the basic premise of this is your heart is not meeting the demands that it needs to take care of your activity. It's not the same thing as cardiac arrest, but it is definitely failing to meet the needs that your daily activities are requiring. So let's kind of jump into the major risk factors. That's right, I'm going to label a new risk factor for you here, and we are going to call these majors, so this is significant. And the majors, first and foremost, start with two kind of non-modifiable but maybe modifiable risk factors, and that is high blood pressure and that is high cholesterol. So these two things, sometimes they are modifiable, especially through diet and exercise, but also medicine and pharmacological interventions. But also we have to understand that sometimes these things come down the pike from our parents and they're familial. And so when that happens, there's some other things that we need to do. So we want you to understand that these could be modifiable, especially if you have high blood pressure and you eat terribly and you don't exercise. Well, then we're going to ask you to do those two things and see what happens. But what we also know is that there's a big modifiable out there, and that is smoking. And so tobacco smoking is by and large the greatest risk factor. It's also the #1 actual cause of death, right? You remember that back from video 3. So we have to look at this and understand that there's a major risk profile out there, but there's also a minor risk profile out there, and I want to kind of explain that. So I'm going to use the other risk factors out there, and the first one I'm going to talk about is heredity. And so I've given you kind of this heredity hierarchy here, right? So you've got all your grandparents, your mom and your dad, and then you. And so it could be said that because your mom and your dad, they had cardiovascular disease, that you're likely to have cardiovascular disease as well. But what we want you to understand and very much appreciate is if you're like me and your mom and your dad had cardiovascular disease, but they smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a piece every day, well, you have to put this into context. Just because they had cardiovascular disease doesn't mean that I'm going to get cardiovascular disease, although I'm very high risk. Now, you put the context in that they were 3-pack-a-day smokers, and I'm a never smoker. Well, that suddenly makes my risk go down. No, I'm not major, I'm kind of minor, but it's still a risk factor. It could play a part in my life. Now, some other ones is definitely age. Remember the age group 45 to 54, big for males. Also, we know that gender plays a role. Males are much more likely to have heart disease, and we also know that race. And what we definitely know is that black males are much higher at risk than any other population. So we want to kind of watch those things. But again, those are non-modifiable. It's not like you're going to say, I'm going to quit having birthdays. Although that sounds nice and it's fun to say, it's not real. You don't want to stop having birthdays because the alternative kind of stinks. So what are our modifiable risk factors for cardiovascular disease? Well, #1, tobacco. Number 2, overweight. If you're overweight, you're 50% more likely to have a cardiovascular disease. What is overweight? Overweight means that your weight could contribute to morbidity. And we'll talk more about that later in body composition, but there's this other term called obesity. Obesity says that your body weight could cause mortality or death. So that's big. In fact, what we know is that if you're obese, you're 90% more likely to have a cardiovascular disease. Also, if you're underweight, you have a risk that's higher too. It's 20% higher for a cardiovascular disease because you don't have the body fat needed to take care of some of those processes, and therefore you could have cardiovascular disease as well. Another one that we're going to look at here is simply physical inactivity or a sedentary lifestyle. We'll talk more about that later, but that's a critical moment to say, how do I affect my cardiovascular health with exercise? Now, stress, especially chronic stress, this is another one too. I'm going to cite you back to the stress video where we talked very specifically about what chronic stress was, and I'll let you infer that from there. The poor nutrition side of things is simply stating if you're not intentional about what you eat, then you're probably going to be kind of subscribing to the standard American diet, which is I eat what I want, when I want, and however much of it I want, and that's not a good way to go. So that's the poor nutrition framework that we want to avoid. And then the last thing on our list is diabetes. Well, diabetes or poorly controlled blood glucose and glucose intake is a big problem. And here's why. Because what we know about type 2 diabetes and this oversaturation of blood sugar is that eventually it starts to damage nerves, but also blood vessels, and that can cause some problems specifically at the heart, but in other areas, and we'll address those as we go through the class. But it's very, very dangerous. In fact, the American Heart Association says that 68% of people 65 or older with diabetes, they're going to die with a heart problem. So that's a big, big red flag. And another thing is adults with diabetes, they're 2 to 4 times more likely to die from heart disease. And that's a big number as well. Now, lastly, we want you to understand what else the American Heart Association says, and they say it's the number 1 out of all 7 modifiable risk factors that you need to prevent. And you're like, how do I prevent something like type 2 diabetes and say it's a modifiable? Well, the thing is you can control type 2 diabetes. Now, not everyone, but most people can. And it's almost always controlled with the proper diet and the proper exercise. So we're going to encourage you to do that, and we're going to talk more specifically about diabetes later. So what is our takeaway from this? Well, number 1, don't use tobacco. And if you use tobacco, consider stopping. And if you don't use tobacco, make sure you have a good reason why not to start. And this is a good reason why not to start. So the next thing is you need to eat with intention. You need to pay attention to what it is that you're eating and not subscribe to the standard American diet. Remember, that is eat what I want, when I want, and however much of it I want. You need to exercise regularly. Now, some of you are like, well, what is regular? Well, I'm going to tell you that, especially when we get into the aerobic and the strength modules. Another thing is manage your stress. Go back to that stress video and let's talk about those top 10 things that we use to mitigate stress. Preventing and controlling your diabetes is important, but we also know that some people, and especially type 2 diabetics, they get it and then they don't always know what to do. Education is key for this one, and I'm going to encourage you to not just seek out what I put out there, but to seek out a professional who is a diabetes educator. Those are your best resources to help mitigate the risks that could come from diabetes. We also are going to encourage you to use your medications as prescribed, especially if you're hypertensive and you use a daily med. Go ahead and grab that daily med and do it the right way. However it's prescribed, talk to your doctor, and if it's not working, go back to your doctor. Get annual screens. In fact, we want to tell you screen early, screen often. And this is primarily at the blood pressure and the blood testing. Now, hold on for a future announcement that will address the specific types of blood tests you should be asking your doctor to perform and then talk to you about. We also want you to understand that using alcohol conservatively is important, but also using illicit drugs those both tie into some cardiovascular health issues. And yes, we do bring in marijuana to this conversation because it's usually smoked, and it does have a link to cardiovascular disease. So I hope you kind of look through this and consider, what are some things that I need to be watching out for? Hope you enjoy the video. We'll see you very, very soon.